Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy Craig, and I'm the scientific co-director of PREVNet. And on behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. Before we start, I'd like to ask that wherever you are located, to take a moment in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating their continued strength and spirit. I personally am situated on the lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee in Kingston, Ontario, and I am a fourth generation white settler to these lands, and I'm on a personal journey to learn how to become a better ally for Indigenous people. Today, we're bringing you the webinar from our community of practice, which has been brought together to address teen dating violence, and it's funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. We're extremely pleased to host this panel discussion entitled Canadian Policy to Address Youth Dating Violence, What Educators and Caregivers Need to Know. Before I introduce the presenters today, I'd like to go through what the format will be for the webinar. First of all, we posted a link in the chat to all the presenters' slides, which are in both English and French. And so you can, if you'd like, you can make a copy, you can print, you can take notes. But they're available in the chat box. In terms of the length of the webinar, today we're going to be running for about 60 minutes, and we'd like this webinar to be as interactive as possible. So we encourage you to ask your questions along the way using the chat box, and I will use my position as the moderator to share those questions and ask the presenters of them. And as well, we have some time at the end of the webinar if you have more questions. And because we're an organization that's based on research, we always like to evaluate what we do. So at the end of the webinar, you'll see a link to an evaluation. I promise you it will only take 2 minutes, but will really help us out in learning what works and what doesn't work and how to make our webinars as educational as possible. Once you've completed that evaluation form, you'll be directed to a website where you'll be prompted to enter your full name and email address so that you can obtain a certificate of attendance, and it will be emailed to you. Just want to let you know there's no connection between your evaluation, so feel free to be honest, and the certificate. I also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded today so that afterwards we can send out a link to all those that have registered so they can share the recording with others if they wish, or if they weren't able to join us today. We'll also be putting it on our website. So enough about the logistics, and it's time to get to the real meat of the evening. So first, I'd like to introduce the panelists in the order that they'll be presenting. Our first presenter is Dr. Deinera Exner-Cortens, and she's the scientific co-director of PREVNet, as well as an assistant professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Child Health Promotion. She works in the Department of Psychology and is in the Faculty of Arts, and she's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Faculty of Social Work, and is also jointly appointed to the Department of Psychiatry, the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology and a Master's of Public Health. Her research focuses on evaluating healthy relationship resources in schools and communities and preventing adolescent teen dating violence. She'll be our first speaker. Our next speaker is Suzie Dunn, and she's an assistant professor at Dalhousie and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Her research centers on the intersectionality of equality, technology, and the law, with a specific focus on technology-facilitated violence, deepfakes, and impersonation in digital spaces. She currently sits on the Women's Legal Education and Actions Fund, Technology Facilitated Violence Project Committee, and is an associate member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society. We also have Taylor Sullivan. Taylor is a second-year Juris Doctor, Masters of Arts, International Affairs student at the University of Ottawa and Carleton's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. She previously held a research internship with the Center for Law, Technology, and Society, which focused on technology-facilitated violence in the law. She is currently the co-president of the Women in International Security Canada chapter at Carleton University. And our last speaker will be Dr. Joanne Cummings, who is the Knowledge Mobilization Director of PREVNet and a child clinical psychologist in private practice. She received her PhD in clinical developmental psychology from York University and completed postdoctoral training at the Hospital for Sick Children. Joanne has been doing bullying prevention work since 1995 and has worked with PREVNet since its inception in 2006. There were a lot of credentials and a lot of well-deserved accolades for each of these speakers. So it's a very exciting panel that are truly experts in the work they do. And so I'm very excited to be a part of this and to moderate it. I'm going to turn it over to Deinera, who's starting the webinar.
Great, thank you, Wendy. Share my screen. Great, so nice to have all of you. Thanks so much for coming on a Thursday. So I'm going to present on what adolescent dating violence is, including its definition, prevalence, and outcomes, just to make sure we're all on the same page before Suzie and Taylor talk about legal responses. So adolescent dating violence, as defined by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, includes physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, and/or stalking experienced within a dating or sexual relationship between the ages of 11 to 18. This can happen online or in person. It affects all genders and sexualities and can occur between current and former dating partners. When we think about dating violence, it's not an either or. We like to think of it on a continuum. So at the far end of the continuum, we have healthy relationships. So these would be relationships that are safe, supportive, and violence-free, and something that we would hope for all children and youth. As we move along the continuum, we might get to unhealthy relationships. So in these relationships, youth may not feel respected. They might not feel that their boundaries are appreciated. So we want to really help youth to have healthy relationships and avoid unhealthy relationships, but even healthy relationships can sometimes have unhealthy components. If we move all the way to the other end of the continuum, we're talking about abusive relationships. So these are relationships with usually severe physical and sexual violence, where the violence is being perpetrated on purpose. And so when people are talking about dating violence, they're often talking about a mix of unhealthy and or abusive relationships, just so we're all on the same page. And certainly relationships with dating violence can fall many places within that continuum. So in terms of prevalence of dating violence, and again, this is really that continuum from unhealthy to abusive. In Canada, we find that 1 in 3 youth experience dating violence. So for cisgender boys and girls, they experience physical violence at about the same rates. This is victimization. So this is being hurt physically on purpose by a dating partner. So about 1 in 10. Non-binary youth are 2 times more likely to experience dating violence, physical dating violence victimization. For both psychological, so that would be someone trying to control you emotionally or hurt you, as well as cyber dating violence, so someone using social media to hurt, embarrass, or monitor you. Both cisgender girls and non-binary youth are at higher risk for victimization than adolescent boys. In terms of who is at risk for dating violence, this is from some recent nationally representative data that Wendy, myself, and my postdoc, Dr. Liz Baker, have been working on. Older youth, which makes sense as you're dating more, you're more at risk for encountering dating violence. Youth who report non-binary gender identity, youth living with less resources, so those living in other family structures other than 2-parent homes, which really has to do with resources and not parenting. The youth with food insecurity, and youth with lower family affluence. So this really speaks to the fact that it's youth who don't have access to resources because of social structures and policies that are most at risk for dating violence. In terms of perpetration or use of dating violence using those same categories, physical, psychological, and cyber, we find that cisgender boys and girls in Canada are using dating violence at about the same rate, about 1 in 10. Non-binary youth are at much higher risk, but it's really important that we interpret this from a minority stress framework. So we can link that risk back to homophobia and transphobia, both really pressing problems in Canada. We also don't ask context in these data, so it's very possible that non-binary youth are fighting back to protect themselves in unsafe relationships. So it's really important to understand it's not non-binary youth themselves that are more violent, it's the social situations they're put in because of homophobia and transphobia. In terms of who uses violence, again, older youth. By gender, we in our data saw that non-binary youth were more likely to have to use violence. Racialized youth, recent immigrant youth, youth experiencing food insecurity, and lower family affluence. So again, really speaking to lack of access to resources and experience of structural oppression. When we look at patterns of use in these data, we find that most youth aren't involved. So that's 2/3 in this pink line here. So these are youth not involved in dating violence. Another third are involved mostly in psychological dating violence. So that's this blue line that peaks for psychological. And then a small percentage, about 6%, are involved in multiple forms of both victimization and perpetration. So when we were talking about that continuum, this purple line are probably the youth that we're most concerned about because they're likely experiencing abusive relationships. In terms of who's at risk, I'm just going to go over that last category, that mutual violence versus experiencing psychological violence. So we find that it's male youth who are racialized and recent immigrants who are the most at risk for being in that lots of violence use and experience group. And so that really, again, speaks to social racism and xenophobia, and that we need to be targeting social policies and access to resources for those youth. In terms of outcomes, some work that we've done, this is from nationally representative data in the US. So we don't have these data in Canada yet. These data are longitudinal. So we looked at dating violence when youth were in high school, middle school, and then outcomes 5 years later. And we found that for girls in these data, they don't report on non-binary youth. Dating violence victimization was related to increased depression, suicidal thoughts, smoking, binge drinking, and then re-victimization by a future intimate partner. For boys, dating violence victimization, particularly psychological victimization, was related to antisocial behavior, suicidal thoughts, and marijuana use, as well as re-victimization, again, by a future intimate partner. And the outcome that concerned us most was this re-victimization because it was so strong and consistent across, in this case, both genders and all forms of victimization. And so looking at that in this sample, using a more causal design, we found that experiencing dating violence in adolescence didn't actually predict it 12 years later in adulthood, but that it appears to start a cycle of victimization. So those experiencing adolescent dating violence victimization are more likely to then experience intimate partner violence victimization in emerging adulthood, so 6 years later in these data, and then go on to again experience intimate partner violence victimization in adulthood or 12 years later. And so there's lots of reasons why we want to prevent dating violence and why it's a public health problem. But a key reason is that it does appear, even in these causally matched data, to predict risk for entering a cycle of intimate partner violence across the lifespan. So really important to prevent. And sadly, of course, dating violence can also lead to homicide. Girls, again, non-binary youth, we don't have data for them on this yet, but cisgender girls are disproportionately likely to be killed by a dating partner. And so this is, of course, an outcome we very much want to prevent. So just before I turn it over to Suzie and Taylor, why does policy matter? So I talked about prevention. We want to prevent those outcomes, including future domestic violence, homicide, and policy is a really important part of that, but it's a part of it that has really been overlooked. So policy helps to guide adults to understand what responses are possible or even mandated. It can tell them, can adolescents access orders of protection against romantic partners? That's a question I get asked a lot. What funding is there for dating violence specific supports? Funding can be allocated through policy. And so understanding what policy exists in terms of prevention and what doesn't and what we might want to exist to do better at prevention is super important. And that is what Suzie and Taylor are going to talk to us about now. So I'll stop my share.
Thanks so much for that. So when we're thinking about legal and policy responses to teen dating violence, of course, there's all of the laws that apply, across board when we're thinking about harassment, sexual assaults, regular assaults, non-consensual distribution of intimate images in the criminal realm, and then, of course, in the civil realm, we have things like defamation, and we have there's a lot of civil protections against some cyber crimes like sharing images without consent. Do you want to flip to the next slide for me? But I think before we start talking about the law, I think it's quite important to think about how we talk to teens about the law. Because the laws can help young people understand what their rights are. And I think that's one of the first steps in helping young people assert the rights that they're entitled to. So you need to talk to young people about the law so that they can feel empowered about what's right and wrong. And so, for example, if they know that sharing nude images without consent is illegal, being threatened, being physically or sexually assaulted is against the law, it can help them stand up for themselves in dating relationships and setting boundaries in their relationships. If they know a bit about what the law is, even if they're not actually actively engaging with the law. And I think when we're having conversations about how the law is used amongst teens, it should be really centered on talking about healthy relationships, respect, and autonomy. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I think it's important that when we're thinking about informing people about the law, we shouldn't be using it as a scare tactic. And so there's some times when we say, if you take a nude image of yourself, that's child pornography, you're going to get in trouble, you're going to go to jail, or if you tell any adult about the things that are happening to you, the police are going to get involved and everyone's going to go to jail, and this is why you shouldn't be doing these things. Those scare tactics can actually reduce the amount of disclosures that teens can have, because they're afraid that if they tell an adult about what's happening to them and their experiences, that it's going to get escalated to a level that's going to make everything worse for them, and they're going to be afraid of that. So when we're talking to young people about the law, we also need to make sure that we're creating a space where they know that the adults who are there for them trust them and want what's in their best interest, and and in many cases they're not actually going to engage the legal system, but instead are going to focus on how to keep that person safe, how to make sure that they have healthy relationships, and how to protect them in the relationships that they're in. And that sense of agency, I think, is quite important in decisions that are being made about them. Next slide. Because in reality, when we think about teen dating violence, most often legal remedies are not going to be used. What we're going to see is that in more extreme examples of violence in teen dating is when we're going to start seeing police involvement and legal responses to the types of dating violence that they're experiencing. And so I think when we're thinking about how to engage the law, there's that communication and trust that needs to happen between teens and adults. But as Taylor's going to talk about as well, there may be some legal obligations if you are a caretaker of a teenager, or if you are an educator of a teen and they do disclose certain forms of violence that they're experiencing. Again, usually more in the realm of physical harms, that there may be some mandatory reporting obligations that are engaged in this. But I think the key thing, especially what Deinera was speaking about, is this idea of this re-victimization and how teens are developing and how teens are learning about healthy relationships. And so I think when we're talking to teens about the law, it's important to focus on the ways that we're speaking about the law so that they can focus on empowerment, they can focus on their rights, they can focus on what healthy relationships look like, so that when they're developing these patterns of relationship norms as teens, that they're going to be able to bring that forward into the future. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it over to Taylor to talk about some of the actual laws that are in place and the policies that are in place around teen dating violence.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzie, for that. So as she just mentioned, I'll be discussing some of the obligations and available remedies to address youth dating violence in 3 key stakeholders, so educators, parents and guardians, and youth themselves. Largely on this topic, the law takes a bit of a piecemeal approach to addressing youth dating violence in Canada, by which I mean there's no one core piece of legislation that defines what youth dating violence is and offers all of the available remedies in one nice location, like it does for issues like family violence or bullying. The available responses also largely vary based on province and territory, as you can see here on the first slide with educators. because education is largely a provincial/territorial issue. Each province has their own education act that outlines the roles and responsibilities of a teacher, including how they should respond to any situations of violence. Usually those situations of violence are outlined in a school board or school's code of conduct, and any behavior that qualifies, which is usually, any type of harassment, physical or emotional violence, everything that Deinera mentioned earlier that constitutes youth dating violence typically can be found in these school board codes of conduct, even if they're not enumerated specifically as instances of youth dating violence. In those situations, a teacher or an educator usually has the duty to report any instances of violence to a principal. Each province and territory also has acts governing family services. However, family services usually pertain to violence against a child as perpetrated by their families, but the act can actually govern situations of youth dating violence as well, because it requires educators to report to a child welfare worker or child services any situation where there is abuse by the hand of a parent, or if a parent is unable or unwilling to respond. And that last little bit, the unable and unwilling to respond, is really where we can use that for a teacher to report to a child welfare worker any instance of youth dating violence. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk briefly about parents and youth. The obligations and available remedies for parents and youth are about the same, so I'll touch on them here. The only difference is that a parent or guardian can report on behalf of their child, whereas a child can report directly. Starting with the Criminal Code and Youth Criminal Justice Act, both of those legislations are federal, so wherever you are in Canada, they apply to you, and you have the remedies under them are available to you. Under these acts, a parent can apply on behalf of, or a child can apply for, a peace bond, which is an order from a criminal court that requires a person to keep peace and be on good behavior for up to 12 months. And you can apply for one of these, or your parent can apply for one of these if they have reasonable grounds to fear that another person will cause you personal injury, or will knowingly publish, distribute, transmit, sell, or make available intimate images of a person without their consent. And that last piece there is a really core example of a type of cyber use for adolescent dating violence. The next available remedy in certain provinces is a protection order, which you can see just below there, below peace bond. This is only available in certain provinces. It is really based on the province and territory in this instance. And it's available in the provinces that legislate intimate partner violence or domestic violence separately from family violence. So specifically Saskatchewan, Manitoba, New Brunswick. And a protection order is available for qualifying victims. And by qualifying victims, I mean an individual who is in a relationship that meets the definition of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in the specific provincial act. For example, in Manitoba's Domestic Violence and Stalking Act, one of the qualifiers is that you must be in or have been in a dating relationship with a person, whether or not you have ever lived together. And that last little bit is key for instances of youth dating violence, wherein most of the time, the two people involved have never lived together, but there could be still a situation of violence. In that type of situation, a protection order is often used on an emergency basis, or can be issued on an emergency basis, and can order the abuser to stay away from any place identified in the order, to not contact the victim or anybody close to the victim, and to not commit any more violence against that person. It is really important to be aware of your own provincial or territorial legislations, because that does dictate whether or not a protection order is available to you. It also dictates whether or not a restraining order is available to you. Typically, they are not. Typically, they are only a tool available in situations of family violence, except for in Alberta. So if you're in Alberta and you're in a situation of youth dating violence, a restraining order is a tool that's available to you. And then if we just go to the last slide quickly, as I mentioned, the available remedies and obligations are about the same for youth as they are for parents. And so with that, I will bring it to a close. But if you have any more questions on the law on youth dating violence, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, great, thank you. Before we show you the actual legislation and map tool, we do have a question. We have a question, and the question is, if a youth goes to the police to disclose police without a parent's knowledge, are police then obligated to let the parent or caregiver know? I'm going to throw that to Suzie and Taylor.
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that one. My gut instinct, and this is not legal advice, would depend probably on whether they're a mature minor or not. Like if they were quite young, I imagine that there probably would be an obligation to inform the parents at some point. But if they were older, if they were 16 or so, there might not be, in the same way that when it comes to medical conditions, that youth do at an older age, become able to make decisions on their own. But I'm actually not sure what the obligations of the police to inform parents would be.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, now I want to do is, what you can tell from that presentation is that the laws that are relevant, there are federal laws that are for no matter where we live, but the provincial and territory laws do differ. So what we've done at PREVNet is we've taken the information from our review of the laws and put it on the map, and we've designed it so that it's friendly to read, friendly to understand, and we've designed it so that you can go if you're an educator, if you're a parent, or if you're a caregiver. So what you will see if you go to that website is this, and then you can you click on the website and then it will take you to the map, I think. Yeah, and then you can click on the area that you're interested in. So Alberta. And in Alberta, it will then give you a brief summary of what's available, what legislation is available. And you can see this is for educators. There's also hyperlinks, and you can get the same information for parents or for youth. And it will also hyperlink you to the appropriate code. So under Alberta's Education Act that we just passed, you could click on that, and that would take you to out of the map and to that particular act. So this is a tool that we put up on the web because we created this because we've been doing some work educating and providing training for educators around teen dating violence, and they wanted to know what their duty to report was. And so what we came to understand in that work was that we needed to summarize it and make it available. So this map is now on our website, and you can go to it and get that information for you. That and in a way that's accessible and friendly, we hope. Our last presenter, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, is to help you think about if someone discloses, what do you do or how do you support youth? So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and to all the other presenters. We'll go to the first slide. So how do adults become aware that there is a situation involving some form of teen dating violence? Sometimes teens directly disclose to an adult. We know that most of the time, teens tend to not disclose to, well, 24% of the times they disclose to no one. They don't tell anyone. Most commonly, if they do disclose, it will be to friends and family. And research suggests only 8 to 40% actually disclose to a teacher or another caregiver involved in their life. So adults might become involved through a disclosure or by witnessing or hearing about teen dating violence between a couple from other peers in a school or a youth organization setting. And we say that when it's very important in terms of prevention to take action and not just be a bystander if you are an adult with information about teen dating violence. Next slide, please. You can imagine that for youth, there are a lot of barriers to disclosure. Young people want to have safe and healthy relationships, but they're not very experienced in romantic relationships. They feel a great deal of love and loyalty to their partner. They often may have no idea that we talked about the continuum earlier, that a relationship can start sliding from healthy to unhealthy to more coercive. They might be in denial. They might feel often that they're responsible for the violence and the problems in the relationship. They might have a sense of fear of what will happen to them or to their partner if they disclose, and they might feel very guilty and ashamed. Next slide. So this sense of responsibility for the violence, the self-blame, guilt and shame really are very strong barriers. They might lack trust in formal sources depending on their life experience. They might feel that adults will come down in a punitive, legalistic kind of manner that will just make things worse. And again, there might be that fear of the partner's anger and repercussions if they tell someone, or that their partner will face negative repercussions. So there are also, youth say, they're worried about confidentiality. If they tell one teacher, will everybody in the staff room be talking about it? Will everybody in all the adults in the school know and hear about what they're going through? Next slide. So when we have a disclosure or we feel that we have to initiate a conversation with a youth because we want to be an actionist, the first thing that we need to do is check in with ourselves. What thoughts, feelings, and reactions come up for ourselves? All of us may have a history in which trauma and victimization have occurred. So it's very important to be able to be clear in your own mind how you're feeling so that you can respond to the young person in the most empathic and helpful way. Next slide, please. So we talk about trauma-informed care. We want to empower young people to reach towards a healthy relationship or have the power to move on. But it's a very complicated process for many young people. Very often we might unwittingly say things that are not helpful. We talked about empowering young people to understand what their rights are. So they do not have the right to control or hate you is a very helpful thing to say. But unhelpful things might come out of our mouths unless we're very clear. We might say, how could you let that happen? Why did you wait so long to tell someone? Things like that are not helpful. So the idea is to be very, very aware of our own reactions so that we can be supportive and empowering to the people who we're talking to. Next slide. It's so important that we affirm that they came to you for help or that they're willing to talk to you about the topic if you initiate it. So you can say something like, a lot of teens have relationship concerns like yours. I'm so glad you came to share it with me. Next slide. It's so important to be honest and upfront about the limits of confidentiality that you may be encountering. So at the beginning of any disclosure or conversation, you have to say, if I'm worried about your safety, then I have legal obligations, I have ethical or moral obligations. You want to provide truthful reassurance that this will not be a subject that you will talk about in any way that will violate their confidentiality. And you have to consider the risk of harm versus the risk of trust and possibly making things worse. I think it was really clear that resorting to a legal remedy is the appropriate thing to do in the case of if you're really concerned about physical harm. But many teen dating violent relationships exist on that continuum to the left of that, so that physical harm isn't the greatest issue, but and especially if you are able to, youth are aware of what makes a healthy relationship and what isn't a healthy relationship, then likely they will be able to come to you earlier and you could provide a sounding board to help them be clear in their own minds what their goals are and what's happening. Is this okay? Is this not okay? Is it not feeling okay? And explore that. Next slide. So after you've explained confidentiality, and so that you're trustworthy because you've told them what's going to happen, it's a collaborative process where you try and get them to articulate what their needs are, and so that you can meet those needs. It's very important to address their concerns about privacy and gossip, ensure you understand them, and find out what their plan is and support them. Next slide. It's important to inform the student or the young person of available resources in their community to provide them the help they might need. And to make good connections. So you want to work with the student's strength or the young person's strength. It's not about how did you get yourself into this, but you had the wisdom and courage to come and talk about this. That shows your strength. Where do we need to go from here? So often it's very appropriate to make referrals to agencies that deal with teen dating violence from a mental health perspective. If as a person in a school or in a youth serving organization, you want to know the referral agencies, people in advance, let the student know that there is help available. Explain to them what they can anticipate if they initiate contact with such an agency. Often a warm referral means you and the student together, or you and the young person together will make a referral. And it's very helpful to have a list of potential resources in advance so that you know where to turn. Next slide. It's important that when you have such a conversation with a young person, that there's follow-up. And again, collaboratively help work with a student to develop a plan. How long should you wait to follow up? How can you do it in a confidential time and space to check in? And finally, it's so important for schools to have policy around teen dating violence so that teachers and educators know what their responsibilities are, and to within the school itself to have a teen dating violence policy and procedure, so that as a person, as a teacher, or at an agency that works with children and youth, you have a sense of what you can do and where you can turn. So at the school level, it is incredibly important, and we know that disclosures to schools happen much more often in schools that are proactive about talking about healthy teen dating relationships, and that create more inclusive spaces for marginalized groups. And staff training, again, is so incredibly important, so that if there is reason, if a disclosure comes your way, or you have a sense that you should get involved, that you have the confidence to do so. So thank you for my part of the presentation to PREVNet, the Center for Sexuality and Suggest.
Great, thank you. I want to thank each of the presenters for sharing with us tonight, and their ideas, their expertise, and their knowledge. Now I'd like to encourage all the audience members to, if you have a question, to put it in the chat, and I can give it to the panel. I know I have lots of questions, but there is one really great question that I'd like to start off with. And the question is from the audience member. I'm curious to hear how the panelists thoughts on how changes to policy can improve teen dating violence. What do you think is the most important first step? I'm willing to take anyone who wants to jump into this one.
I'll jump in. Just to reiterate what I just said, that I think that youth serving organizations, schools, and other youth serving organizations should have education to raise awareness. As Deinera pointed out, 1 in 3 young people in Canada experience some kind of teen dating violence, and most adults are not aware of it, and therefore not at a point where they would initiate a conversation or be a sounding board. But if you have conversations with young people about what healthy relationships are and what their rights and their rights to safety are, then you're creating a climate in which youth are likely to disclose and get the help they need at this early stage in their dating life.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think when we're thinking about the educational piece and talking about healthy relationships, there's the aspect of describing what healthy relationships look like. And I think when we're talking about dating violence, we need to be talking about, what are the impacts of victimization and what do you do if you've been victimized in dating violence, but also what to do if you're a perpetrator of dating violence. And often in relationships, you can see unhealthy behaviors on both sides. They might be more severe on one side than the other. But this idea too, that if you're a person who is engaging in dating violence as a way to manage your relationship, how do you step away from that? Like, how do you learn different behaviors around, emotional regulation and this type of thing? So I think that educational piece is really important when we're thinking about the type of the quality of education that we're giving. And policy wise, I think one of the major improvements that we can do in policy is also making sure that we have culturally specific resources for people. When you look at the statistics that Deinera was sharing with us earlier, you can see that there are particular groups of people who are more likely to experience dating violence and more likely to perpetuate dating violence. And they need to be able to go into culturally relevant spaces where people are going to understand what it's like to be a non-binary person. They understand what it's like to come from, an impoverished family, or to be coming from a particular immigration community, and to be able to get services and responses that are relevant to the community that they're a part of, so that they can also feel safe and comfortable and have people who speak their language in a particular way.
Thanks. I'm going to sorry. I was going to throw it to you, Deinera, right now with that. So I'm going to let you, I'll let you say what you want. And if you don't answer the question I had, I'm going to follow up with it.
All right. Well, yeah. First, just to draw on what Suzie said, it is so important. Like, anti-racist policy is teen dating violence prevention policy. Basic income, lifting families out of poverty, that's all teen dating violence policy too, even though we're talking about some very specific remedies. So I would just say that. The thing I would like, and Taylor and Suzie can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think any of these policies actually said the word adolescent dating violence or teen dating violence. So I would like, if it was in the policy like bullying is, I think we need to name it, because when it's not named, people may not even realize it exists. It is still a fairly new field. I get a lot like, oh, well, just dating, adolescent relationships aren't that serious, but they are very serious to youth. And they can, as I was showing, have long-term implications for health and well-being. So I would really like dating violence to be named in these policies and for there to be some sort of consistent framework across provinces and territories for youth who do need that more like higher level remedy for the situation that they're experiencing.
I'm going to set you up a little bit further because I know we've had lots of conversations about this. So I think there's a need for a consistent framework, which I hear, and a need to call it out. But I guess, how would you go about developing that framework? Because I think that's a key part about having relevant policy. Deinera?
Yeah. Okay. You can also answer if you haven't. I mean, for me, like, we have not asked youth what they want. I have a graduate student right now who's going to be working on it's something that I've wanted to work on for a long time. Like, we know some things about primary prevention or how to prevent it before it starts. We know absolutely nothing about how to support youth after dating violence. Like Joanne was saying, some of the research on disclosure, but what to actually do and what youth want is just unknown. And I think it's unacceptable. Like, we need to really listen to youth and let them lead us, and in culturally competent and relevant ways. Yeah, because I think, there's a little work on orders of protection, but that's really, as Taylor was saying, one very specific remedy. So what would be helpful? And what, the question I get a lot is like, what would prevent that cycle of victimization? And I don't know, because we haven't asked youth what happens and what, why do they find themselves more at risk and what could help them get out of that? And so listening to youth and letting them be at the forefront is really critical. I don't know if that's what you want, but that's what I think. So you can add
That's
what
what
you
I was thinking, but no, thank you. I'm going to move to another question. What, if any, responsibility do the parents of the perpetrator have when the sexual violence occurred at the perpetrator's home with and without the parents present, after it was made clear by the parent of the victim that they did not want the youth left alone? and the one parent of the perpetrator agreed verbally and in writing to abide by these wishes.
I'll jump in and tackle that.
Great.
So each parent's responsibility, or it really depends on the province or territory that you're in. As I mentioned in my presentation, every province has their own Family Services Act, which defines and outlines rules and responsibilities with respect to family violence. It sounds like from the scenario that you presented that there was some type of verbal agreement and written agreement between the parent and the perpetrator of violence. If that was an agreement in the form of a protection order or a peace bond that went through the courts, that's kind of the extent at which it can go. However, if that's just some type of agreement drawn up between the parent and the perpetrator, there was no type of legal oversight for that. The next available remedy would then be to pursue either a peace bond, which is issued by a justice of the peace, or to go even further if it's an available remedy, and to file for an emergency protection order or a restraining order if it's available. In this case, again, it sounded like the violence was in the household, and that it amounts more to family violence than it would a youth dating violence relationship. And in that case, a restraining order would probably be a more available or readily available tool.
Great, thank you, Taylor. That was great. Okay, next question. So some opening presented material included the study of youth outside of the gender binary. What obstacles or additional considerations are anticipated by researchers and policy professionals as this population is studied more in depth in the future? E.g., trans youth may not wish to disclose their gender identity in addition to their experience with teen dating violence. These are not easy questions, but you're on the panel.
It's really good. Yeah. So, I mean, such an important question. I will say we know extremely little about trans youth and dating violence. Most of the research has come out in the last year or two, and it is at this point a lot of prevalence data, kind of like what I presented. So we do know, they are at much higher risk again because of societal transphobia, homophobia, like I talked about. In terms of obstacles, I mean, one thing I think about that if you really need this remedy, you need to involve the legal system. If you are a trans or non-binary youth, you may have had really negative experiences with the legal system. You might risk being dead named if, legally your name change hasn't gone through. So I just think there are already so many barriers for youth accessing, if orders of protection are even an available remedy, there's a lot of barriers for youth generally. And then I think about trans and non-binary youth and having to think about engaging with a system that has been at best, perhaps not friendly, to at worst hostile and or violent towards your community. And so I think, that moves us to we can't only have legal responses. We also need to focus on restorative justice and other responses, because the legal and policing systems are not going to be okay places for all youth. But that is something, I think we really need to look into. Like I said, what do youth want? And not just all youth, but by population. So what is it that trans and non-binary youth need to be supported when if they experience dating violence? But maybe.
Yeah, and I think in that, when it comes to trans and non-binary youth, the reality is that, fairly often they also lack family support in their lives. And I think that's something really critical to think of, because often when we think of, how can we support youth, how can we help young people, we often think of healthy family relationships, and in some cases, because of, homophobia and transphobia, even within the family household, the family might not be a place for them to go and find support and love and care, and places where they can go to safely disclose without fearing being kicked out of the house or fearing other risks that are heightened for that population of people. And so again, I think this circles back to this question of when we're providing services, when we're providing supports, are we making sure that there are services that are appropriate, particularly for vulnerable populations like trans youth, who are at much higher rates of violence, they're much higher rates of homelessness, and are much more likely to lack a supportive, loving home environment, and taking those considerations quite seriously when we are working with anyone's working with that population.
Yeah, and you both made me think about that. What we presented really is, intervention in the law, and there is a whole continuum of actions that we can do before that. And we really need to develop those through policy and support, because many of these vulnerable populations are going to do better under sort of those kinds of interventions versus the law intervention for many of the reasons you've mentioned. Oh, I can't help but talk. I'm sorry. Okay, going on to another question. What is the rate of digital relationship abuse in Canada, where a teen partner is using technology to emotionally, physically, psychologically, and socially control their partner?
So, Suzie.
Oh, yeah, no, go ahead, Deinera, or I can go. So this is one area of research that there is a real lack of data across the board in Canada. So when we look at tech facilitated violence, the statistics that we're relying on are out of Australia, they're out of the US, and they're out of the UK. We have very little data here in Canada. We're starting to see some projects coming through. There was a Plan International did a big study about young people experiencing harassment online that involved Canadians. It was focused on girls. It wasn't on dating violence. It was just on general harassment that they're experiencing online. So we've seen some data there, but really we are lacking data. This is something that I've recently been applying for funding for, to recognize and actually get some statistic on what are the rates of youth dating violence in digital spaces, and amongst adults too. We don't even have the data for adults. Really, I've been working with CG on doing a global survey on people's experiences of digital violence in intimate partner relationships and outside, but it's a major area that we lack data, which is extremely problematic right now, because we are seeing governments pushing to regulate around these issues and create criminal laws and create content moderation regulation, when we're not even actually entirely sure what this looks like, how common it is. And going back to what Deinera was speaking about, is what is the response that youth actually want from the law, from policy, and from society. But there's a real lack of Canadian stats. If you want stats on youth in general, I'd recommend looking to Australia, but you can't compare across countries at all times.
Yeah, and just to add, like, the only national data we have is the data that I just presented. So that's from the Health, Behavior, and School Age Children Survey. It was nationally representative. It is cross-sectional, and that's about having a partner use social media to hurt you. And so, as I presented, about 15% of cisgender boys and girls report that, experiencing that, about 30% of non-binary youth, but that's it. And so, as Suzie was saying, and we were recently on a panel together to push for this, like, data is so important. We understand so little about the experience of youth in Canada when it comes to dating violence, including tech facilitated dating violence. So it's really critical that's another policy thing, is funding for national ongoing data collection on dating violence.
Okay, as we're coming close to the end, I'm going to ask each of you a question to sort of give me what do you think are the next important things that Canada does in terms of research and policy in the area of teen dating violence? And anyone can go first.
Well, clearly, just to summarize what we've heard, we need a lot more Canadian data looking at all the different forms of what we consider to be teen dating violence. Anecdotally, in my practice, I'm hearing a lot about social media perpetrated dating violence and control, and tracking people on their phone and using GPS and saying, I thought you were going to the library after school, but I see you were at so-and-so's house. So I think we really need to understand that much better, because I hear about it a lot. I think so. We need the data, and we need a national conversation to increase awareness. I think that's majorly important.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go next, just to build on what was said earlier as well. In terms of what Canada can do as a whole, you know, I'm a law student. I was formerly a political science student, so I'm going to be a bit partial to government for a second. But I think we need to name it, like as Deinera said earlier, but we need to define it in legislation, and we need to make it clear and accessible. Right now, you know, prior to PREVNet launching this amazing resource, we've been asking people to kind of go on this crazy fishing expedition and searching for what type of remedies are available, searching for how they can even quantify what they're seeing as youth dating violence, if that's what it is, or if it's something different. And so I think we need one piece of legislation, whether it's by province or on Canada as a whole. I'm more partial to Canada as a whole, just because it's a lot easier, a lot nicer, a lot more accessible. But, you know, something that easily defines what it is and outlines the remedies, the available tools and resources, and the obligations for each party involved. And I think until we have that, it's going to be more organizations like PREVNet or others kind of supplementing or trying to provide these resources where the law and where government has just honestly failed at this point. And yeah, I think that's kind of where we need to go from here.
Thank you. Well said. Deinera, you want to take the next?
Oh, Suzie unmuted. So Suzie can go and then I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I love the law. I think law should be in place. I think law is extremely important for its expressive power and telling people what's right and wrong. I think that having laws around these issues is extremely important. But really what I think people need is they need education on emotional competence. They need education on sexual pleasure. They need education on healthy relationships. And I think so much of this it needs to be taught in schools. It needs to be taught in our sex education programs, and particularly around what to do when you're feeling stressed. Like, I think this basic thing around like healthy communication and healthy emotional expression is so important, particularly when it comes to sexual relationships and emotional relationships. With the internet out there, people are looking at Instagram, they're looking at pornography, they're looking at all like fantasies of what relationships look like. And even in media, you know, like these ideas of romance are based around sometimes like stalking behavior, you know. And so recognizing the difference between fantasy and romantic film, fantasy and pornography, fantasy of relationships on Instagram, and then the reality of what healthy relationships look like and how to moderate healthy emotions, I think is the most important skill set that we can create. And I think we should be doing it from when they're born. You know, like, let's just start when they're born and do it for the rest of our lives. Even all of us can use it. I'm sure all of us can use more education on how to balance our own emotions and have healthy relationships. But I think that's the best thing that we can do.
Absolutely. Okay, Deinera.
It's like a million things. I mean, data's been said, obviously very important. I did see a question, and maybe I'll answer to this because I think there's a million things we need about, you know, doesn't the criminal code deal with it? I think it's what we know from research in the US, which is a bit further along, is it's really important that it is specifically named and it's specific, it goes to specific courts. So like that dating violence can be in family violence court is really important. So yes, there's general laws about violence, but it's actually really important that it's dating violence specific. So I think for me, like where we're at is just, we really are still in an awareness phase. So I think for a lot of folks out there, I mean, we're speaking to people who are here on a Thursday night, so you know what it is or now do, but I think for a lot of people I talk to, they don't even know this happens, and it's quite common. It's at least as, if not more common than teen smoking, binge drinking. So it is really critical to get it on the agenda so that we can put it in curriculum, so that parents talk about it, so that it's addressed in youth programs. So I think we're really still in an awareness phase to let people know this does happen. And it's important that we're putting funding, policy, prevention programming, all the good stuff that's been talked about towards preventing it. So yes, awareness, I think, is where we're at.
Thank you all for those comments. And what I'm taking away is that we may have adult laws that address it, but they're not developmentally relevant to our youth, and they don't reflect the youth and the developmental needs and the capacities and recognize the developing child. And so we need to specifically name it out, we need to call it, and we need to have developmentally relevant policy. And that involves prevention, intervention, programs, and education. So thank you. Grateful that each of you took the time to share your knowledge and expertise. And I think we're all going away having learned something, and I hope becoming more impassioned about a critical issue to ensure and joining and working together to make Taylor's dream come true, to develop more policy and laws so that we can ensure the health and well-being of our children and the health and well-being of their relationships. So thank you very much for attending. I just want to remind you to follow the link that is now in the chat for the evaluation of tonight's webinar. And also to keep going, once you complete that, you can get your certificate of attendance if you need that for your profession. So thank you again to our presenters. Thank you again to our audience for spending time with us tonight, and take care and be healthy. And be healthy in relationships.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.